now we are a bit back in the Cold War with the Human Rights Council, so that the national human rights institutions are not even allowed to speak. Even now with the changes, it's only in the plenary where everything has already been decided. So in fact, whether they speak immediately after the state or a little bit later, probably not that important. But I think what would be important is the national human rights institutions actually speak during the peer review. But I would like to have your other comments. But would this be selling ourselves to becoming a governmental institution, or is it the lesser evil?
I have said in many different occasions that I think that if you want a success story of the impact of the UPR process on national human rights work, come to Denmark, because it has changed the way we work, basically. My first encounter with the UPR process was a very terrible, horrible, confusing meeting I had in my first office at the Institute when I just started. It was in the early spring of 2009, and then Anders, who was a department director, Charlotte as a department director, I think Lis and Annette and Lisbeth Arne came to my office and talked about something, and they made absolutely no sense of what they were talking about. And then came a year later, in this room, Annette Fey made a presentation of the UPR process after they had gone through the analysis. And she basically described the 4 limbs of the process and how the UPR process would work. And then I began to dawn on him, okay, this makes sense. I mean, we have a role to play in this. At the same time, we had meetings with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We invited a key person on all the monitoring work, the reporting work, and basically said, you should include us in the work that you're doing. You could use us in your reporting work and all that. And he started out saying, but why? And after an hour he said, of course, I will include you. They got closer and closer to us, and we got closer and closer to them, and we had very open discussions with them on exactly how they could work with the UPR process. First things we did was we discussed with them how they could draw a framework for hearing the line ministries. So for them the task is, we don't have a national action plan in Denmark, so we have no overview of the human rights issues in Denmark. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has no insight into what the different ministries, what their human rights priorities are. So they had to come up with a way of asking questions that they could then manage the answers into some kind of framework. Then they decided that they wanted to have a UPR process that could do some new things, be innovative, and show this is a way you could do a UPR process. So they decided that they wanted to create a web page where people could comment and provide suggestions for the Danish, or the states, the government's UPR. They wanted to have public hearings. So they decided they would have public hearing in Copenhagen, they would have one in the second largest town in Aarhus, they would have one in Greenland in Nuuk, and one on the Faroe Islands in Tórshavn. And their concern was, how do the civil service in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs go into dialogue with people who walk right in from the streets? Will they be held accountable to the government's human rights policy? So they were uncertain or insecure about how could they take these meetings with the public that they were supposed to have and they would like to have. And then I offered at a meeting, said, well, I can do it. I will facilitate the dialogue. We co-hosted public hearings. And I was walking around the microphone and talking to people. We clustered the Universal Declaration issues, put them on the wall. I had a discussion, short introduction, people put little yellow posters on the wall, and then I would go around to each cluster, it could be family life or whatever, and then said, go through the notes and say, okay, there's an issue here, what do you mean by this and this and that? And basically had a dialogue, and basically had people to comment on it. And when people got a little bit critical, I said, yes, I understand your concern, I may share it, I may not share it, that's not the idea. The idea is for you to give your input to the civil service. And all in all, this basically meant that we had a much closer relationship, developed a much closer relationship to the government, and a clear understanding of what is the government's role in this and what is our role as national human rights institution. We suggested that we should also have hearing of other state institutions. not only government institutions, but parliament, the ombudsman. We have 3 ombudsmen in Denmark, in Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. The Children's Rights Council, and I think a few other institutions, and then the court administration. And then I said to the ministry, but I think it's more proper for us to hear them because they're independent of the government. It is a national report, so it should be the government that asks independent institutions of their work on human rights. We should do that as an independent state institution. And after some negotiations that I don't want to disclose, it was basically accepted that we did that. So we sent out all these letters to these independent institutions. We got their feedback and we shared it, of course, with the ministry, and they took it into account, and we took it into account. And I don't think it made much of an impression on many others than us and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For me, it's a step forward in securing or in developing our role in society as an independent state institution, and use the UPR for that purpose. And it was immediately accepted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and after some discussions also by other key ministries. So basically they're beginning to understand that we have a different role, and we are framing our role differently. In the Institute we have a board of 13 members, 1 staff member, Erik André, by the way, 6 appointed by universities and 6 appointed by the Council for Human Rights. The Council for Human Rights is about 80 institutions. It's the political parties represented in Parliament. It's the relevant ministries, and they have no right to vote. And then it's civil society organizations. I think about 40 civil society or 40 or 50 civil society organizations. And then we came up with the idea that we could get them to submit a joint stakeholder report to the UPR. They could, of course, do their own reports, but they could also do a joint one. And that allowed us to basically convene meetings with NGOs that were interested, getting their ideas into what would they like to see in a report. Lisa and Martin had numerous meetings with them, and we didn't decide what that would be in that report. They decided, they had negotiations. One organization left the group because they disagreed. The rest stayed. So basically we ended up with 10 NGOs writing a joint stakeholder report that was submitted to the UPR process. We also, because of this closer relationship with the NGOs, coordinated the press work. So the staff in our communication department met with staff from some of the larger NGOs and their communication department, and basically agreed on a press strategy up to the UPR. So basically, for the first time, we agreed that we shouldn't, we basically agreed that we are not in competition, that we are in cooperation, and that we would happily as an institution leave issues to them, and they were very happy to leave issues to each other and to us. And I said, that's very interesting that they are going out with this issue now, and then the press person said, yes, but that's the agreement, that's part of the strategy, they do that now, and we wait till later and so on. So it worked quite well. After the examination in Geneva, or the morning when Denmark was supposed to comment on the recommendations, I called the key stakeholders in this joint stakeholder group, and they all basically agreed and were all ready to go out and comment on the recommendations that we would suggest that we expect the government wouldn't accept. And what was extremely interesting in that context was I talked to one of the NGOs, and she said, well, I thought it was a wonderful examination, and I really felt that the UN heard us. So I could see that some of the work that we have put into our joint stakeholder report was actually picked up by governments, brought forward in the Human Rights Council as questions and recommendations to Denmark. So the UN heard us. And I felt that you heard us too. I felt that you were there for us because you included in your work things that we put forward. As you said, and I feel that the rights of the child has been lifted in this process because we had a platform out for discussing these issues more broadly in Danish society. It may be a small group of people who are interested in human rights work that did that, but it was again a signal of them seeing us playing a new role and we seeing them playing another role vis-a-vis us. So I think we have cracked a nut, which is how do the national human rights institutions work with NGOs? Because there's also always been this kind of competitive relationship, I think, which has been quite unfortunate. And I've been looking for many years to figure out how do we get out of this? I mean, what is the specific platform? And the answer basically is to work together on specific issues. And then we can get things rolling and build up new relationships. We established a new relationship with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We established a new relationship with the NGOs, at least the major NGOs that are closest to us. And we basically decided that our stakeholder reports that we developed in the fall would be a stakeholder report only on the structure of human rights in Denmark. We wouldn't go into the substantive issues because the public hearings weren't finalized then, the government's report wasn't finalized, the stakeholder reports of NGOs wasn't ready, so we would do something on the structure. And basically that meant that we had to focus more specifically on how do we implement human rights in Denmark. And also we at the time, we were quite acutely aware of the fact that we couldn't deliver what we wanted to deliver. We couldn't deliver an overall view of human rights issues in Denmark. So if we were to make a full report on the human rights issues in Denmark, we simply couldn't deliver. Because we at the Institute, although we've been here for 24 years, we never developed a full human rights baseline of human rights issues in Denmark. So we realized that we couldn't deliver what we wanted to deliver, and now we're in the process of developing that. Very late in the process, when all the stakeholder reports were in, and the government's report was ready and all that, we decided to have a meeting with the ambassadors in the representations to Copenhagen. And then we invited the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to be here, because there's no secret in this. Basically say these are the human rights issues. And of course what happens is that Geneva says Denmark is up for UPR. They ask the capital asks the embassy in the given country, and they have a staff member who has to figure out, okay, what do I send to someone who has to read out a paper in Geneva. So the best people to influence are basically the key staff in the capital. We basically made a 30-page compilation of the main human rights issues and sent that out. And we know that that was read by at least some embassies, because in that the green compilation of suggestions put into the process, we added new issues, because at that stage we see what are the issues that are not covered. And some of these new issues were mentioned in the council examination. So we know that somebody had read it. I think we had about 40 embassies represented, about 20 ambassadors, and about 20 on a lower level. But quite good turnout at the meeting. So how did it go, the UPR? Well, the Danish government made a very strong statement at the beginning, basically by starting out saying that they would like us as institutes to have a floor in the working group session. They were also very happy about the good process we had, and they ended up basically saying that they could accept most of the recommendations coming out during the examination. Of course, it turned out that they couldn't accept or comment on any recommendations. They were quite unhappy, basically that they couldn't say anything, because it's been quite a while since governments in our part of the world has basically said we won't comment on anything, because they are not able to provide statements on Denmark's behalf when it comes to human rights. And this meant, of course, that the discussion died. In Denmark, there's been basically been no real discussion after that, because there's been nothing to discuss, because we don't have a government's position on the UPR recommendations. It didn't help too much either that Osama bin Laden was killed the morning of the UPR examination. So we had an agreement with the television station that I should be on at 10:30 at night, if nothing happens. And then Tuesday morning we were having breakfast, and the Danish news called me and I said, yeah, they're calling and they wanted to comment on whether it was in accordance with international law that they killed Osama bin Laden like this. So it was difficult to have a debate because of Osama bin Laden, because of the lack of replies from the government, and now everything is up for elections. So in a way, this also basically drowned the UPR process. We realized that we do not have a holistic baseline of human rights issues in Denmark, and we need urgently to develop that. And by urgently, I mean by 5th of May 2012, when we have our 25th anniversary. That's when we have to present it. And I'm not sure that the government will develop such an action plan by themselves. but then we will basically help them do it, because if we have the holistic baseline, here are the issues, then it's easier to suggest issues that should be steps to be taken to meet these various challenges. And then I think that we also, because of the cooperation we have with NGOs, we need to move that forward and take it out of the UPR and into the other treaty bodies. So we have something to build on, but we need to move that forward and basically keep up this work of basically using these cycles and see our role in this, and articulate again and again that we have a different role to play than any other actors, and this is why basically this is our raison d'être. It's because we can do things differently that we need to be around. And what we need to do, I think, urgently, or not urgently, but as a matter of priority for the national institution, is to build a strategic relationship with the key NGOs, global NGOs. Because if Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, some of the other major institutions basically say we need strong national human rights institutions, then we have very strong support. And they have an outreach to members that none of us really have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think one of the most important experiences was the way in which the Foreign Ministry engaged all the other ministries. So there was a coordinating committee, cross-ministerial committee. We coordinated between in the civil society to a large extent. They used lots of energy and lots of resources, and they were, it seemed to me, quite exhausted afterwards. So it's been a lack of systematic follow-up, and the same. We had the same critical remark as you had, the lack of an action plan. It's really, we tried to get all the countries to challenge Norway to start developing a new action plan for human rights, but it hasn't happened. And basically, I would say that the political climate for such active role by the government in the field of human rights now is not the best.
So I would have to change whenever I'm teaching about national action plan. I'm always saying Norway was the first country that had an action plan. Yeah, so I was kind of assuming that it's still ongoing.
So yes, there was also a meeting, but we did not have such an active role. The Foreign Ministry invited people, NGOs, and we came and we made some remarks. And then the Institute had to decide, the German Institute, a very important issue. We have specific team-oriented studies and recommendations, yes, but not the overall 300-page report. So should we come with a UPR report on our own or not? We have not done this over 8 or 10 years to this day. And we said, yes, we wanted to have a German Institute human rights report. The disadvantages are obviously you position yourself in a public process against the government. You put it like this, and people will not like it. And how good are you on this? How good information do you have? What is your analysis? Not so easy. Number two, something we sometimes forget, if we position ourselves, not only vis-à-vis the government, we also position ourselves vis-à-vis NGOs, which usually are much more critical, and might perceive our positioning as undermining their position. Because an NGO might be much more critical about refugees, migrant workers, police abuses, than perhaps the Institute on its basis. And so they send in their submissions and we send in our submission. And of course there's a link between the two. Other people will read it and say, the Institute only says sometimes there's a problem with this and other people say there's a structural problem in Germany with police treatment of refugees, for example. So there are quite a couple of what I would call human rights political issues. You have a little bit to take into account when you do your things. We are now considering more often to make our own position papers and not just to facilitate NGOs to develop their comments when it comes to treaty bodies or UPR. There's a certain movement in the Institute. So that was a major interesting thing. When we came out with our UPR comments on the German situation, it was not greeted everywhere with enthusiasm. No television. There was one major political party which asked our director to come, and he had to defend the German institutes report paragraph by paragraph, and I'm not exaggerating. They were very critical, they were unhappy, they felt it's exaggerated, and it was a difficult moment. Beforehand, we knew that there were two positions in our foreign ministry, either to go for a more self-critical explanation of the German situation, or to go for, I shouldn't call it defensive, but let's say a more self-conscious position, saying, look, we do well, we have some problems, and we care about the problems. So that would be perhaps the second position. The first position would be, look, we have a couple of serious problems. The self-critical position would not get the support by the leadership. So we went for more self-conscious. No? We do things quite well, we have perhaps here and there some problems, but we work on that. Afterwards, as I'm aware, very little has been done. So there was the recommendations, and in the German political sphere, there was a lot of resistance and criticisms that certain countries tell us what to do in the area of human rights. We got recommendations from Iran, we got recommendations from Egypt about migrant workers' treatment, and I was at some of the meetings where UPR recommendations later were discussed. And it was, the typical reaction would be, how could they tell us what we should do? Meaning, we should not take care of these recommendations, which is a bit weird, but it was often to say, they should not tell us what we have to do. Final point I want to make, when it comes to human rights discussion, at least in Germany, critical NGOs, some other academics, often feel that this reporting business, as important as it is, and there's more and more reporting, is sometimes not helping so much on the progress of human rights, because government essentially restates its old positions about human rights. That refugee policy is okay, that we have a state of rule of law things and so on, but there's very little of progressive positions. And so sometimes people wonder whether the energies you spend on the reporting is well spent compared to other things you could do. Because we, last thing, in Germany, every 2 years, the foreign ministry puts out a big handbook on human rights in the world and German policy, 380 pages. And they cover everything from OSCE to Africa, Asia, Latin America, German foreign policy. But essentially, a lot of that is a restatement of your old position. There's very little new. You report, but what does it mean for the development of your, I'm talking about the government, government's human rights positions? And there is quite some frustration or disappointment that a lot of energy is being spent, but what does it change in the situation on the ground?
The New Zealand Human Rights Commission, as Jonas said, we did formally submit a 5-page report. We also had very rigorous discussions within the Commission about what should and shouldn't go into it, particularly and the points you've raised about, you know, are we covering all the things that were really human rights issues in New Zealand? Are we being critical enough? But one of the things we agreed to do is that we would use some of the space to highlight achievements, because actually in our experience, recognising the things that government has done that do strengthen human rights does two things. Partly it protects those things, and so government itself, I mean, one of the real challenges for NGOs and for us is, for the first time in a reporting process, we had to do our reports before the governments. We had to take the first steps. And some of the NGOs found that really difficult, because it's easier to react. But we argued that actually it was fantastic, because we could begin to shape what would have to go in the government's report, because they would have to take account of what we and the NGOs had submitted. It could have been a disaster. In fact, the New Zealand government's report was delayed for that reason. And what we had to do was persuade the government that it shouldn't be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, who led it, who had no interest in human rights, quite the reverse, but it should be the Minister of Justice, who had responsibility domestically, because Foreign Affairs, we said, doesn't have any responsibility domestically. And that's had a beneficial effect throughout this term, the term of this government's office, because actually he came to Geneva, and what he saw suddenly made him realise that this was something of value, that New Zealand, that his government, who didn't want to take it seriously, should take it seriously. Now, it doesn't mean that that's been a panacea, it hasn't, but it's been a huge asset. And he then led the New Zealand reporting to the Human Rights Committee against the advice of his officials. And he said to me, Ms. Noonan, do you think I should lead the delegation to the Human Rights committee. And I tried not to sound too enthusiastic because I thought if I did that would probably be the kiss of death. I said I thought that would be a very interesting idea, and yes, I would certainly support it. And he said to me, well, my officials have strongly recommended against it and said the risk factor is far too high. I mean, what we have done with the UPR recommendations that the government's agreed to is we've factored them into our second comprehensive review of how well human rights are recognised and respected. That's the 2010 report, I think, that Jonas was referring to. And we're in the process, because we have the statutory responsibility to develop an action plan, so we're in the process of developing the second action plan for human rights in New Zealand, 5-year action plan, which the government's very nervous about, but we're trying to reduce that nervousness by showing them that we're going to draw on what they've actually committed to, and then help them develop a program to actually implement what they've committed to, as well as have elements which push beyond that. So that's just very quickly. There are other things about the NGOs and things, but I won't go into it now.
Instead of doing consultations first, we went around the country doing information sessions and basically saying, here's what it is, very simple language, got rid of the jargon, the UN speak, because the biggest issue we found is when you start talking about shadow reporting to NGOs who've never done it, they just don't want to try. It's off-putting. You have to make it so simple. So essentially what we did at these information sessions was sit down and say, okay, what are your issues? They all know what their issues are. And they can put those on the table, and then you teach them how you put those issues into a very simple report. Then when it came to engaging with the state, it was very interesting, obviously, because my country had a few problems, as you might have heard. So the state was a bit distracted, and UPR was very low on its agenda. So what we did was we invited the state and the NGOs to our first consultation, and then when the government collapsed and they reassigned it to another one, it got a bit complicated, but eventually they did hold their own consultation, and it was a great success. These civil servants were amazed. You could see them looking at each other going, really? Oh. And it was fantastic, and it was brilliant to see the state actually engaging, and I don't think that really happens with treaty reports. And now the state is in the middle of its own consultation, so we've done 3 last week and tomorrow, and they've actually invited us to participate, as well as the NGOs. So they have a panel. We have 2 gentlemen from the Department of Justice, and at the end of every session they're just astounded, and they come up and they ask us more information. And the big thing now is, will they put it into the report? And I really hope they do, because this process has been so different, and that it's a really unique opportunity. So we'll see, fingers crossed.
How do we help governments develop what they should develop to do what they should do, rather than how do we yell at them for not doing something and being passive and reactive? How are we proactive and engaging basically independently and sometimes confidentially with how they can progress? I think that's the issue. But I wanted to pick up what Wolfgang said. Again, how can we secure a follow-up? So one of the things we could do to secure follow-up as national institutions is to try to have these debates and facilitate them. You have a council in Germany, we have one, they shouldn't get together, but maybe they should get together. Maybe we should have the German civil society organizations talk to the Danish civil society organizations about how can you go about using UPR and so on. So I think, again, it's facilitating the debate, rather than we are saying, and we'll end up saying, yes, we did it. No, we didn't do it. Somebody else did it, and we helped them do it and gave them a platform to work and gave them ideas on how they can move things forward.
NGOs play a very important role by also setting the agenda. So they put many of the issues for both standard setting, but also which countries should actually be addressed, with which human rights phenomena should be addressed. NGOs were very much the ones who were setting the agenda by naming and shaming and their advocacy role.